You are headed over to the Russian embassy in Kyiv, Ukraine, to get your visa updated so that you could go live in Moscow yet again, I guess for what, like a few years?
Well, I was actually living in Moscow at that time. I had an apartment there. I had all my things in Moscow.
Oh, you were already there?
I had already been in Moscow for a number of months. I had basically organized my life there. And,
no kidding.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of my, my personal things were all in Moscow, my apartment. And the only reason I left Moscow was to revalidate the visa, and I had the necessary documents to do that.
So you show up at the embassy, you hand them the documents, you're expecting to go to Moscow, and then they tell you what?
Well, what happened is they said that there was no telex from the foreign ministry authorizing the issuance of a visa.
What's a telex?
Telex is the way we used to communicate years ago. It's a kind of a machine which you print out messages on.
Oh, is that a telegram?
Yeah,
That's what it is?
Basically a telegram. Yeah, but it's a machine for receiving telegrams. Let's put it that way, and that's what they were still using at the embassy at that time. And in any case, they said that they didn't have any authorization from Moscow to issue a visa. This was actually December 24th. It was Christmas Eve, and since Ukraine is an Orthodox country, the 25th is not celebrated as Christmas. The Orthodox Christmas is a little later, and as a result, the embassy was open on the 25th. But on the 24th, the diplomat in charge in the Russian consulate said that we just don't have an authorization here. And I said, but look, I've got the necessary documents on me. And he said, I can't explain it. I said, have you ever had a situation in which someone who had been given the necessary documents did not get an authorization from Moscow? He says, this is the first time it's ever happened. And then I called, he advised me to call the foreign ministry, and I did call the Russian foreign ministry, and they said that I should contact a diplomat by the name of Mr. Gruby. I remember his last name.
Alex
Gruby, yeah. And in any case, I called him the next day, and he says, I've got something to read to you. And that was a bad sign. And he said that the competent authorities, which is the term they use for the intelligence services.
Is that the FSB?
Yeah, the FSB, the Federal Security Agency, has decided that your presence on the territory of the Russian Federation is undesirable, and you're banned from entering the country. Now, of course, all of my personal belongings were already in the country, but that meant I couldn't go back to get them. In the end, my son went and cleared out the apartment.
Oh, they let your son in?
Well, yeah. I mean, they didn't have any objection to him coming in and just taking personal articles, which is what he did. But I couldn't come back in, and I haven't been allowed back in since.
And what's notable about this is you were not just any other guy. You had been effectively a journalist covering the USSR and later Russia for almost 4 decades at that point, correct?
Absolutely. And I was the first American journalist to be expelled from Russia, to be banned from Russia, since the Cold War. And I still hold that distinction. There hasn't been another one.
And weren't you also the last guy to be let back in after the Cold War, too? Or something like that?
Yeah, when I was the last person to be given permission to enter the country after, and to be accredited, after the Gorbachev reforms had already completely transformed Russia.
Taking
and
it from the USSR.
they had opened up the country to virtually everyone, and except for a small number of people, and I was the last one on that list. So I can claim to have been both the last person to be let in and the first person to be expelled.
When was the first time you were banned? 82?
What happened was I left. There was actually an attempt to expel me in 1979. At that time, I was accused of hooliganism.
Hooliganism?
And my visa was my accreditation. I'm sorry, I was given temporary accreditation, and then that was withdrawn. And what happened was both the American embassy and the British embassy. I was an American citizen, but working for an English newspaper, the Financial Times of London.
Is that the only? I'm sorry. Is that the only paper you work for? I thought you worked for a couple though.
Well,
you work for Wall Street Journal too.
The Wall Street Journal came later.
Okay, got it.
But when I was in the Soviet Union, I was the accredited correspondent of the London Financial Times.
Got it.
And it was unusual in those years. Now, of course, it's quite common. There are a lot of Americans work for the Financial Times, The Economist. A lot of Brits work for American publications, Australians, and so on. But in those days, it was quite unusual for an American to be the correspondent in Moscow of the Financial Times.
Yeah, it's the height of the Cold War.
Yeah, it's the
the
height of the Cold War, and the Russians or the Soviets assumed that neither the British nor the Americans would really defend me under those conditions, but they both did. And both the British and the Americans threatened to expel Soviet correspondents if I was not allowed to stay in Moscow.
Wow.
And they backed down in the end, and I was able to stay in the Soviet Union until 1982 when I finally left. But after that, I was not able to come back. I was banned from entering the country until 1989, 1990, when the Gorbachev reforms had reached such a point that banning an American correspondent made no sense at all, because they were dismantling the Soviet legacy and dismantling the Soviet Union. Whether they realized it or not is another question. So there was, as I was informed, there was a list of correspondents they didn't want back, but they whittled that down and they finally allowed me back. At that point, I had a relationship with Reader's Digest to write pieces for them. And they wanted Reader's Digest to open up a Russian edition. And Reader's Digest said unless I was allowed back in and given accreditation, they were going to cancel plans.
Wow.
For the Russian edition. And the Russians gave in at that point and said, okay, you can just come back.
It's got to be such a weird time, too, though, because it was such a flip of the switch. I mean, I guess in a way throughout the 80s, and you'd know a lot more than me, you could see it cooling off as far as like the stringent nature of the USSR and what it was built to be. But, I wasn't alive when it fell. I talked to people who were, and they were just like, one day it was this country and another day it was this whole other thing. And the shock of that from like an organizational standpoint, like if you're running the new government or working in the new system or a holdover from the old government and now you have a new set of rules that you follow, I can only imagine the number of cultural shifts that are occurring all at once and the frankly little decisions like this, like, oh, do we let this person in? Do we let that person in? It's like, it's got to be crazy.
Oh, it was. People who believed in communism suddenly found that their faith was shattered. You have to remember that the Soviet Union was based on lies and on the suppression of truthful information and a false version of history. That all of this was fed to people generation after generation, and it was obligatory. So when Gorbachev began his policy of what was called glasnost, it was a kind of revolution because they, for the first time, started telling the truth about a lot of what had been hidden. And this created a psychological crisis for millions of people. I mean, people wrote letters to the newspapers saying, it looks like everything I believed in was false. My life has no meaning. The ideals that I thought were important were based on nothing but lies. And it was a real psychological crisis for a lot of people. And a lot of people, in a way, didn't survive it.
What do you mean?
Because once the Soviet Union fell and the whole economic system was transformed, people who had been programmed to fit into the old way of life and who had justified that with a lot of false beliefs were faced with the necessity to adapt to something that nothing in their previous experience had prepared them for. And not everyone, there are some people who are adaptable, but a lot of people are very rigid, especially in a system like that. And they became severely alcoholic. They became ill. There was a rise in suicides. There were murders. There was accidents that should not have happened and that would not have happened if the person had not been in a state of great distress.
Well, what you're starting to get at there is obviously what we then saw transpire in the 90s. And I would love to talk about that at some point today because I think Russian history in the 90s is, to say it's an overlooked topic, at least in America, would be an understatement. And I have to say, I'm very, very excited to have you in here because for people listening right now, I was literally embarrassed that I didn't know who you were about 3 weeks ago until a few people pointed you out. Because in my opinion, obviously now with everything going on over there, for sure, but even before that, you're someone who, your name should be known by everyone. And you're known, obviously, in all the international reporting circles and things like that because you've been doing this a long time. But you are the guy from Western media who blew the whistle on Putin. And someone who I trust a lot with their opinion said of you, this guy knows Putin better than Putin. If you want to know about Putin, you talk to David Satter. And I was like, say no more. But what really blew me away was the recounting of the case that you first were on to Putin with. And so I read your book, and I always, The Age of Delirium is the one that I remember right away, but I can't get this title right, so I literally... It's
the less you know, the better you sleep.
That's it. I had it written right here because I kept on doing like the Luca Brasi line from The Doctors, or from The Godfather, The Sleep with the Fishes. But yeah, The Less You Know, the Better You Sleep. Brilliant book. And you outline in there, you rehash some of your reporting that you had in 1999 on Vladimir Putin's rise. And what left me speechless is I had read up on it before I read the book, but then actually reading the evidence that you uncovered and how this all came to be. And like I said, we'll go back to the 90s, but it is insane to me that given especially the nature of how we're talking about Putin in the media right now, which righteously so is negative, it is amazing to me that people do not know this story. So for everyone listening, or most people listening who are not aware of this, can you explain what happened in 1999 and how Putin then became president in early 2000?
Yeah, I'll be glad to do that. And I certainly agree that this is an episode that is so important. I mean, I personally regard it as the greatest political provocation since the burning of the Reichstag. And what happened? Well, just as background, the economic system in Russia after the fall of communism began to be transformed. You have to remember that under communism, everything was state-owned. And the so-called young reformers set about creating a market-based economy with private ownership. And they didn't particularly care who the private owners were. The idea was to distribute state property and put it in private hands as quickly as possible.
Were they trying to move to capitalism, per se?
Absolutely.
Okay.
They were trying to, but they didn't understand that capitalism requires the rule of law. So it didn't matter if there were criminals who received the property. It didn't matter if the process was totally corrupt. It didn't matter if...
It's a beautiful thing watching more and more of you invest in an 8 Sleep Pod Pro cover every week, and therefore invest in yourself and your sleep. The 8 Sleep Pod Pro cover comes in queen or king sizes. It goes right on top of your current mattress, and it ties directly into 8 Sleep's proprietary app, which measures your sleep stages throughout the night, your body temperature, and a whole bunch of other scientific things that affect your sleep so that you get the deepest sleep possible. And as I like to say, you'll wake up in the morning after sleeping 6 hours and feel like you slept 8. So if you use the link in my description, along with the code TRENDIFIER at checkout, and this is very, very important, make sure you plug in this code. I've had a couple people not plug in this code and not get the $150 off that you get with it. But you will see a box that says, I think literally like promo code. You type in TRENDIFIER, that's TRENDIFIER, and you will get that $150 off your 8 Sleep Pod Pro cover purchase. Or if you want to get the full mattress, which is the same product, but it comes with an actual mattress as well, you will get $150 off that too. So use that link in my description, use that code TRENDIFIER at checkout, and improve your sleep today.
If the only qualification for becoming a billionaire was that you had the right connections, they proceeded at a breakneck pace. And they did put the economy in private hands, but they put it in the hands of a criminal group, all of which had connections to those in power. And this group was mostly concerned with pillaging the economy. The national income in Russia fell by half. That didn't happen even under Nazi occupation. But perhaps the most important thing is the death rate in Russia soared. It rose vertically. And if you take that period, the 1990s, when these so-called reforms were being implemented, it's estimated that there were 6 million surplus deaths. Now,
what do you mean surplus deaths?
I want to try to explain this. This is a demographer's, it's called surplus mortality or surplus deaths. Demographers make certain projections about what the population of a country is going to be, after a certain number of years, and they do it by extrapolating from existing trends. So if the death rate is pretty much what they predicted, then they consider that the model is correct. But if there's a discrepancy, as there was in Russia, with many, many more people dying than they could have anticipated as a result of the analysis of existing factors, they refer to that as surplus mortality or surplus deaths. Well, that figure in the 1990s was 6 million people.
And how big was the population approximately?
You see, there was also migration from the former Soviet republics. There were other factors. There were people who left. But the population was roughly, in the high 140 million, so say 146, 147. And then there was also, there were also births. But that high death rate in Russia was not duplicated in any industrial country. The only place you could find a death rate like that was in African countries that were at war, like Somalia.
Right. I see what you're doing here, by the way, so I should have known this. This makes more sense. You are going through some of the 90s. So just to stay on this, did I read it correctly that there was also the economic impact was like their economy went down by like 50% compared to like our 30%?
Yeah, basically cratered. Yeah, it cratered. People were driven into grinding poverty. But the point that I'd like to make is that, with this high death rate, which is people just gave up on their own lives. There was an atmosphere of total despair. people became convinced that their lives had been worthless, that it was pointless to struggle. The economic situation was grim. It was hard to get decent medical care. And this plus, of course, the poverty created, of course, an extreme reaction against Yeltsin.
And Boris Yeltsin was the guy.
Boris Yeltsin was the first president of post-Soviet Russia, and his popularity ratings fell to virtually zero. I mean, officially it was 2%. In any survey, they say that 6% don't understand the question, so we can guess that maybe no one in Russia supported Yeltsin, or at least very few people. And this was the setting for the events that took place in the summer of 1999. Now, I was in Moscow at that time.
Were you there for much of the 90s, or were you kind of back and forth?
I was going back and forth, yeah.
Okay.
I was going and spending going back and forth, but spending very long periods of time in Russia.
So that's important because you're seeing this up close.
Yeah.
You're in the community. You speak Russian. You talk with the people. You can see for yourself. You can see the changes. It's got to be that point you made early on there, and when you were talking about the lack of information. That's a crazy thing, especially in America, to think about, but especially today, given the internet. Everything's a click away. But these people effectively for 70 years, whatever it was, were fed one form of news, in huge air quotes there. They were read one, this is the way it is. It's like Animal Farm, like you work and you like it, and that's it. And now suddenly you're like, oh, there's brands out there. We're going to let them in. Oh, there's a whole economy out there that works an entirely different way. We're going to do that too. And I'm just trying to imagine like being, I don't know, like a 40-year-old person with a couple kids and suddenly being like, what? It's impossible to imagine it.
Well, it was a mental crisis for a lot of people and many people could not adapt. One of the indications was the suicide rate, which went way up.
Yeah. That
was one sign among many. But the point is, we get to 99, we get to the summer of 99, and after this period of grinding poverty for the most of the people and premature death for many of them, the question is, who's going to be the successor to Boris Yeltsin? Will it be someone that he appoints or that he anoints? Will it be someone who repudiates, the harm that he's done to the country? And it was at this point that Vladimir Putin became prime minister. He had been the head of the FSB, the intelligence service,
which was the KGB before that, right?
Yeah,
in Soviet.
This is the successor organization.
Got it.
Then he became the prime minister, and in a telephone call with Bill Clinton, Yeltsin said that the next president of Russia is going to be Vladimir Putin. He's a good man. You'll have no problem working with him, etc., etc. How Yeltsin could have been so sure that Putin would be the next president when he himself had a popularity rating of 2%, and when Putin, in the only opinion poll that was taken at the time, had a popularity rating of 2%, is a question that bothered a number of people at the time. But the next day, apartment buildings began to be blown up in the middle of the night in Moscow.
And this is the story you broke.
Yeah, and this is this was the provocation. This was the crime that brought Putin to power. And what happened was that 4 apartment buildings were blown up in the middle of the night. The targets were apartment buildings in working class areas, just ordinary Russian citizens, not government buildings, not not the homes of the oligarchs or of the super rich, but
in Moscow and
Moscow, in two other cities, Buynaksk and Volgodonsk. And there was nationwide panic.
How many people died?
300. And the authorities accused Chechen rebels. Now, Chechnya is a region in Russia in the North Caucasus, which had achieved its independence as a result of a war of independence that was fought in the early 1990s.
That was the First Chechen War?
The First Chechen War.
Okay.
And they were accused of blowing up these buildings, and that became the justification for a second Chechen War. And that second Chechen War was pursued successfully, in part because the Russians had prepared for it well in advance. They were using banned weapons, cluster bombs, for example, and thermobaric weapons that are banned for use against civilians, but they used them. And they made progress in the war. They bombed the Grozny market. Grozny is the capital city of the main city of Chechnya.
And Chechnya, just to be clear on that, it's a Muslim stronghold of, I guess, like Caucasian, what are supposed to be Russians, but they were when the Soviet Union was around, they were a part of the Soviet Union, right?
Yeah, no, Chechnya is a region that was part of the Soviet Union, and it's inhabited by a nationality that is Muslim but rather tolerant in terms of its religious attitudes. Now there have become more extreme Muslims in Chechnya, in part because that's been cultivated. But the culture of the place was always religiously tolerant.
And how many, like approximately how many people are
Only
in
about
Chechnya?
1 million.
It's not huge.
No, and the territory is the size of the state of Connecticut. It's not even as big as New Jersey.
Wow.
So it's a really small territory compared to the vast territory of the Russian Federation.
So they had the First Chechen War in like maybe 94 to 96, where they then, as you said, declared their independence.
Yeah, the Chechens, because they defeated the Russians, had created, created a separate state, and the Russians agreed to it. They were defeated in the First Chechen War, but they never really gave up, because in 1999, as we were saying, when the buildings were blown up, the Chechens were accused, and the Russians launched a new war.
Which they won.
Ultimately, they won, yeah. They were able to pacify Chechnya, but...
And did they take it in as a part of Russia? Or
yeah,
was
it's now a constituent part of Russia, at least officially. Everything would have worked out. And then, well, as a result of the success of the war, Putin, who had been put in charge of the war, became popular overnight. This is a person no one had ever heard of. When he was nominated to be prime minister, the nomination was ridiculed in the press as something ridiculous for such an unknown person without political experience to be named prime minister. It struck people as strange.
He wasn't this was a question I had from your book. I don't know if this was cleared up. So I did not realize Yeltsin named another guy as the prime minister, and it sounded like, maybe I read it wrong, but it was only for a few months or something, then he fired him and then brought in Putin.
Yeah, I mean, Putin was the fifth person to occupy that post in a year and a half.
Oh, wow. A lot.
Yeah, and so all of the candidates were carefully vetted to see if they would do what Yeltsin wanted them to do, which was to protect his family, which was massively corrupt.
Because he thought if he lost power because of his low approval.
Well, he thought that there would, that anybody who took power after him would immediately begin to investigate his family's corruption, plus the corruption that accompanied the whole privatization of state property.
Which we'll come back to. That's the oligarch thing.
Yeah.
But what is just for people out there to understand, because I don't, what is the key differences back then between the presidency and the prime ministership when it comes to powers that they have?
Well, at that time, the president really was all powerful. Not all powerful, but his power could not be checked by the government or by the legislative branch. This was the result of the Constitution that was adopted in 1993. But we can come to that.
Yeah.
But what I think we ought to look at now is how then, in this situation where Yeltsin had zero popularity practically, he took this unknown and uncharismatic person, Vladimir Putin, and first of all predicted he would be president, and then saw that his prediction was fulfilled. Yeah. Because the bombings traumatized the country and redirected the people's attention away from the corruption that had flourished under Putin and toward the Chechens, who became a convenient enemy. And the war against the Chechens resembled a holy crusade against malicious terrorists who murdered innocent Russian people in their beds.
Can we go back to that bombing, just so that, because you said the high-level details. There was 3 different cities, Moscow, and then the other 2 you said. And it was over maybe like 12 days or something like that? This occurred?
Something. I think it's 12 days, actually.
And as you said, over 300 Russians died.
Yeah.
The government effectively blamed it on the Chechens.
Yes.
So then you get to start the second war.
And they began a new war with Putin in charge of the war.
And so this is your typical, when you look at the definition of like false flag, I mean, you might as well have a picture of this.
Well, yeah, indeed. But the thing is that they would have gotten away with it had it not been for the fact that they made one mistake.
And what was that?
They tried to blow up a 5th building. And but by this time, the population was very vigilant. And someone saw them putting a bomb or putting sacks of some strange substance in the basement of a building in Ryazan, a city southeast of Moscow, called the police. The police came, went down into the basement, saw the sacks with a detonator and timers attached, ran up in panic, called the local bomb squad. They tested it, tested positive for hexagon. Now, hexagon is the high explosive that was used in the other 4 bombings.
Same bomb.
Yeah, it was the same bomb. And they deactivated the bomb, but the entire area was evacuated. The building was evacuated. And there was a dragnet in the city. The whole city was cordoned off, and they arrested 3 people who had put the bomb in the building.
That were seen outside.
Yeah, and they turned out not to be Chechen terrorists.
Who were they?
They were agents of the FSB.
The Russian FSB.
Yeah, Russian FSB.
So how did they explain that away?
They said that, this was all part of a training exercise to test the level of vigilance of the population, and they said that the population had done very well, and they congratulated them. And in fact, a telephone operator who had intercepted a call between the FSB agents who planted the bomb and FSB headquarters and reported it to the local police was given a color television as a reward for her vigilance.
And the public bought this? That's what really blew my mind.
Well, not only the Russian public, but the American public.
Did they even know about it, though, in America? Like, I feel like they didn't report your reporting.
There was some reporting, but nobody picked up on it. the journalists, I did, but I mean the journalists whose job it was to cover this and to raise questions did not. The State Department, whose job it was to raise questions, did not. And as a result, it was treated, the most important event in post-Soviet Russian history was treated as a non-event, something you can't talk about, but which everybody knows about, at least everybody in the circles that should know. In any case, under these circumstances, the true nature of the Putin regime was, on the one hand, revealed by the arrests, and on the other hand, concealed by those who refused to face the obvious truth. I mean, there were other incidents besides the Ryazan incident. For example, Gennady Seleznyov, who was the Speaker of the State Duma, which is the parliament, announced on September 13th that a building had been blown up in Volgodonsk. Well, the building had been blown up in Moscow on Kashirskaya Chaussee.
He slipped.
He simply got the order of the bombings wrong. 3 days later, the building in Volgodonsk was blown up. Well, there's no way to know that a building is going to be blown up in a city, a medium-sized city somewhere in the middle of Russia, unless there's a pre-existing plan and that it's been shared with high officials.
See, I got angry when I read that because, and obviously you've already talked about this today, but I know this is something that you're always hitting on because you're always reminding people of this story and how it needs attention. But that was the smoking gun to end all smoking guns. The guy was 3 days ahead of a bombing that hadn't happened, and no one raised that as an issue. It's like, to me, that's like having the guy on tape saying he murdered his wife 4 days before it happened.
Of course, yeah.
It's insane.
I mean, no question. And that plus the fact that KGB or FSB agents were caught putting a bomb in an apartment building. And the claim that this was a training exercise is so absurd that only some of our American careerists could believe it. It was, first of all, absurd because in the case of any civil defense exercise in Russia, all the local authorities have to be alerted, and none of them knew that any such exercise was planned or was taking place.
So that's like regular police and all that.
Yeah, and more to the... But that's why they arrested these guys. They thought they were Chechen terrorists. On the other hand, it's also true that the car in which they were driving was a stolen car. Well, if you're carrying out a legitimate training exercise, you don't need to use a stolen car. Similarly, I talked to someone who was in the Ryazan police force at the time, and he told me the atmosphere there was not the atmosphere of a civil defense operation or a civil defense exercise. He said it was as if an atomic bomb had gone off, given the panic not just in the city but in the police force, of which he was a part.
Sure.
He said there was no question that this was a real attempt to blow up a building. And there were 400 people in that building. If it had been blown up, it was at the top of a hill. The debris would have hit the neighboring building, which also had 400 people, with the force of an avalanche. And it would have destroyed that building too. So 800 people would have lost their lives that night.
So of all the bombings they did, which was supposed to be 4, but instead it was 3, the biggest one of all is the one that luckily was the one they messed up, it sounds like.
The potentially biggest one was the one that they messed up.
There was another thing you had in there, though. I don't know if this was something that you got, a story that you got, or if it was another reporter who had it, but it was even more comical, where it's called Hexagon, is that right?
Hexagon is the explosive.
Right. So there was a report that a couple, I guess, like Russian soldiers or FSB members were told to watch over these items or something for a night, and it was...
Oh, yeah. This hexagon was stored in a warehouse outside of Ryazan, and a couple of soldiers were told to keep guard over it, and one of them thought it was sugar, punctured the bag and tried to make tea with it, and then before he just tasted it and realized this is not sugar.
And why would you be guarding sugar?
And why would you be guarding sugar? Yeah.
And
that's what they were told. They were guarding sugar.
I don't know if this was another thing, but it was also therefore traceable, as in some of the concoction that was made in the bomb, whether it was the hexagon or some other things in it, it was provable that Chechnyans didn't even have that, I think. That.
Because hexagon is only produced in one factory in Russia, which is under tight FSB control. The Chechens, there was some massive evidence of circumstantial evidence, but there's also direct evidence. The Chechens just didn't have access to hexagon. Only the FSB had access.
The other really bizarre thing here, I almost forgot about this, was how they also took the time to create a motive as well. So there, and maybe I misunderstood some of this. It was a little weird to me how it went down, but they tried to, when the Russians were saying, well, why did this happen? It had something to do with the 1,200 Chechnyans had invaded Dagestan for 5 minutes and then had been kicked out.
Well, it was more than 5 minutes, but still, there was a group of Chechens who had invaded Dagestan.
And what is Dagestan?
Dagestan is also a region of Russia in the North Caucasus, also inhabited by a mixed but largely Muslim population, and but that had not declared its independence of the Russian so-called Federation, and whereas Chechnya had. But this movement into Dagestan by Chechen fighters was, by all appearances, a provocation. It was they were lured into attempting this with false information, and they and in fact the Russians made no attempt to stop them. They pulled the border guards, and when they withdrew from Dagestan, they were not fired upon. So it resembles a situation in which they were allowed to enter Dagestan to give the appearance that the apartment bombings, which were already planned, were taken in revenge for a defeat in Dagestan.
And that was something I was confused on. Was this a particular set of Chechens who had other motives, and so they were okay basically like playing the role in this?
I think that the rumor that was, they were told that if they invaded Dagestan, that this would lead to the overthrow of Yeltsin, and that the new people who would take his place would agree to Chechen independence.
Got it. So was this...
And then, they went there with that expectation. But they were really being used to prepare the way for the subsequent bombings.
And that was in approximately August, something like that. Okay. There was a little piece of reporting in there that you mentioned, and then it was nothing else. So maybe this is tying it together. Now it's making sense to me. But did I understand it correctly that there was some sort of secret meeting between representatives from Russia and representatives of this sect of the Chechens arranged at Adnan Khashoggi's house in Monaco or Nice or something like that?
Yeah, in southern France. I think it was Cap d'Antibes, if I'm not wrong. But I don't know. We can check that.
So it could have been an inside job right there.
Oh yeah, it was an inside job. Boris Berezovsky, who was the leading oligarch at the time, was the big organizer of all this. And I think it was his clever idea to bomb the buildings.
It was just bizarre to me, a little creepy, that Khashoggi was in the middle of it. Because
well, we don't know if he was or wasn't, to what degree he knew about, what was being hatched.
That's a whole different conversation.
Yeah.
We don't have to go down that. But for people out there, Khashoggi is a guy who, among other things, he was an international arms dealer, alleged sex trafficker, and somebody who is viewed as a mentor of Jeffrey Epstein. You talk to anyone in government who worked in FBI, CIA, something like that, you say the name Adnan Khashoggi, they all know it. So you guys can go Google him. But I want to stay on what you're talking about. So the bottom line is there's some sort of inside provocation that happens where they get the motivated Chechens to agree to do it, and then this bombing happens in September.
Which they then blame on the Chechens. Correct. And say that it was revenge for their defeat in Dagestan.
So now you have, this is September 1999. The presidential election is supposed to be June 2000 at the time, I think.
April.
Didn't he move it up, though?
No, late March. Late March it was.
But didn't he move it up?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, by statute it would have been in June, but by resigning early.
Yeltsin. And when did he resign?
He resigned on December 31st, 1999. And that gave him the opportunity to appoint Putin acting president and to move the date of the election up by 3 months.
So that's 3 months after the bombing, approximately, that Putin gets in there as acting president. 3.5 months.
Yeah.
So Putin is now in there for, call it 90 days ahead of an election. And because they've started the Second Chechen War, you now have nationalism going on in Russia, who's happy that we're getting back at the Chechens for doing this, and they see this guy as the leader. So that 2% approval rating you talked about just flips on a dime.
Of course it does. Yeah, it gyrated, and Putin quickly became the leading candidate, just as they figured he would, because he was no longer identified as just a colorless stooge of Yeltsin. Now he was the leader of the nation, consolidating the country behind a holy war to punish those terrorists who had murdered Russians in their beds. And the Russians, it shows the total contempt for the ordinary Russian person that they would pull something like this.
You had a line in there that I thought broke that down really well, and I'll mess it up if I say it, but it had to do with the lack of value on human life and how Russia, what the Russian leadership under Putin and Yeltsin before him has shown is an ability to sacrifice their own at a whim strictly to maintain / grow power. And that's a scary, scary thing for.
Well, that's why Putin is so dangerous. That there's no human feeling there. Whatever is in the interests of the state is justified, and the interests of the state are identified with his personal interest.
Now, when did you get a hold of this story, though? Like, were you investigating this immediately after it happened and reporting on it ahead of that election?
Yeah.
Wow.
Because it was too convenient. It was obvious to me that something was wrong, that Yeltsin and anyone connected with him were headed for defeat, that privatization was going to be reevaluated. And then we have these explosions, and suddenly everything looks different. The whole national conversation is transformed from a discussion of corruption and abuse of power under privatization to how can we punish the Chechens?
And you decide to come out with a book.
I actually began writing articles about it, but then the book came out.
Amalgamated all of it.
Yeah, but I had written earlier. The first article I wrote was in the Washington Times, an op-ed entitled "Anatomy of a Massacre," and that was published, within weeks after the bombings, in which I first raised doubts about their authorship.
And that didn't get attention.
No.
Anatomy of a Massacre.
Yeah.
It's a great title.
Well,
it's a blank spot in history to me, because I really knew nothing about it. And you would think in the media right now, they would be jumping on something like this, to like rewrite their own history of, oh, sorry, we didn't cover this, but look what he did, just to gain power. But what's amazing is that you also could have seen it coming, because they did this in 1993.
Yeah, I mean, the use of provocation to achieve political goals is characteristic of a communist country.
And it's not supposed to be communist at this point.
Yeah, but it's communist mentality. These are people who grew up in the communist system.
Right.
And they, my friend, the late writer Vladimir Vinovich, said the only thing left of the Soviet Union is the Soviet man.
Wow. Do you think that Putin privately looks at himself as a Soviet, or does he separate and look at himself as the leader of an entirely different political system that is now Russia?
I think that he doesn't acknowledge the extent to which he was formed by the Soviet Union, although he does, his personal psychology, although he's perfectly willing to talk about, the grandeur of the Soviet Union and that its collapse was a geopolitical tragedy, as he puts it.
Because effectively they lost their power.
Well, they lost their colonies. They lost the countries that they were able to control. And the most important of those was Ukraine.
And why was Ukraine the most important? Because they had a lot.
Well, because it's a big country, and it's a populous country, and it's a country that, together with Russia, creates a kind of really massive state. It's not the case that Russia can reclaim former glory if it unites with Belarus, which has a population of 10 million. They would need a substantial bit of territory.
Doesn't Ukraine have pretty solid resources too?
Yeah, it does. It's a great agricultural area. Has some oil, but mostly that comes from Russia, the oil and gas.
Got it. So let's fast forward for a minute and talk about where we're at, because you, at the very beginning, obviously mentioned you got expelled from Russia. You weren't allowed back, but that was the crazy thing is that was 14 years after this bombing, or roughly 14 years after this bombing. And you were reporting on this, writing books, writing The Age of Delirium in 2001, and living throughout a lot of that time in Moscow, and you were never kicked out before then.
Well, they didn't want to. They decided early on that the proper strategy was just to ignore what I was writing. They saw that nobody else was paying attention to it either. And, I think they were bothered by it. But even though I had some high-level outlets like the Wall Street Journal, nonetheless, these obviously damning facts never, influenced American policy.
Do you think that's because there were distractions? Like we were more, the Cold War was over, then 9/11 happens, we're in the Middle East, and you start to talk about Russia, and people are like, what is this, 1985?
Yeah, I think that part of it is that they felt the world was not paying attention, and they didn't want to create attention. After all, I'd been writing about Russia for a long time, and if I had been expelled or if something had happened to me, it would have, the gain for them was always much less than the potential loss. And as a result, they just allowed me to continue to work in Russia. And of course, I wrote about other things, not just about the apartment bombings.
Yeah, let's talk about some of those things, because these are more events I knew nothing about. But one of them was, I think it was the Moscow Theater. Was that it?
Yeah.
So that was 2002, and what happened there?
Well, an army, a literal army of Chechen rebels took over a theater in the center of Moscow. They were showing a musical called Nord-Ost, which in English is northeast, about the settling of the northeast of the country, and it was, a very, very popular musical, and the hall held 1,000 people. And these terrorists took the entire hall hostage and started making demands, I think, including for an end of the war in Chechnya.
And they were actually Chechens in this case.
In this case, they were.
Okay.
But there were very strange aspects of this. They trained openly in Moscow practically for months. Why weren't they stopped? And they also collaborated on weapons production.
What do you mean by that?
Well, they were trained, I would say. And also they produced, up to a point, certain weapons with the help of an instructor from the GRU, that's the Russian military intelligence. So why was that happening?
They were training. The GRU was training Chechens.
The Chechen terrorists were being prepared by the GRU.
Did they know it was a GRU person, or were they undercover?
I'm not sure what the terrorists knew, but the GRU definitely knew that the terrorists were planning a terrorist act.
And they let it happen, is the implication.
Not only let it happen, but apparently facilitated it. And as a result, the terrorists were able to take control over the theater, and they were only defeated when the theater was attacked with poison gas, which of course killed many of the hostages.
This was a wild scene in your book, reading about this and the inhumanity of it. But allegedly the gas had some strain of like fentanyl in it or something like that?
It appears that way. The Russians have never identified the makeup of. They have never revealed what exactly the gas consisted of, but people died as a result, and a lot of them. The death rate was very high.
And it kept on adding up because people were dying a year later from this.
But with the after effects.
Yeah. So it was kind of bizarre because the way you were explaining it is that there was some sort of like negotiation allegedly going back and forth, but it was never really a negotiation. The terrorists just thought it was. And so the hostages, the terrorists were saying to them, we really don't want to hurt you, so I think it's going to be okay. The hostages were like, okay, great. And then suddenly, a couple days in, they put the gas.
Then the hall where the theater's flooded with gas. And then the Russians stormed the place and shot the terrorists who were also knocked out by the gas. Now, those terrorists were potentially very valuable sources of information. Why shoot them, especially if they're not resisting?
And how many were there, approximately?
How many of them? I think, if memory serves, 40, 45.
Jeez, and they killed all of them.
Yeah, apparently. But those terrorists would have given a lot of information about who recruited them if they'd been allowed to live. But the Russian authorities apparently didn't want to take that chance.
And then they're taking all these people out of there. The scene was just absurd to me.
There was no preparation
None.
for evacuating people. No regard for human life at all.
They didn't tell the hospitals what the gas was, so people weren't getting treated because they were trying to figure out what was even in them.
They didn't know what would work as an antidote, but so they guessed. People were crushed in the vehicles as they were being transported in non-emergency vehicles to the hospitals. It was a chaotic scene, of course.
And so that's right there, hundreds of people. Another wild event.
Yeah.
2002. But then 2004, in a different way, there's another one, and I think it's Beslan, the school.
Yeah, the Beslan School Massacre, because the school was on September 1st, the first day of school. A mixed group of terrorists, including Chechens, Ingush, and other nationalities, including Ukrainian converts, or Russian converts to Islam. And they seized the school, and the terrorists herded the parents and teachers into a gymnasium, which was then attacked by the Russians with flamethrowers and grenade launchers.
Where people were dying left and right, like hostages.
Of course. In fact, they set the roof of the gym on fire where the hostages were being held. It collapsed on top of the hostages, and people were burned alive.
What was the motive, though, on this one?
I think in the case of both the theater siege and the Beslan siege, the motive was to discredit any movement toward negotiations. This is also explained by the fact, this also explains why it was that many of the terrorists had just been released, days before from Russian prisons, and many of them had been obviously protected by the Russian security services, including a convert to Islam who was one of the leaders of the group of terrorists, who was ethnically Russian.
I just don't know why they would, especially after the Nord-Ost one in Moscow. Is that how you say it?
Yeah.
Especially after that, I don't know why terrorists would agree to do something like that. Like if their implication is they're let out of prison so they can go do an attack, because they see what happened in the last guys, they just all get executed. And then it happened again.
Yeah, well, they should have been more wary. The explanation that I find the most convincing was that the Russians were allowing the terrorists to train with the idea that they would attack a local government building, take some hostages, and create an excuse for the Russians to go in and destroy them.
Thank you guys for checking out this clip. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. It is a huge, huge help. And if you'd like to check out this clip's full podcast episode, that link is in the description below or right here. And finally, you can follow me on Instagram and X by using the links in my description below.